Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I have collected an ECW brain trust of a couple Gettysburg guys today. Dan Welch and Evan Portman, thank you both for being with us today.
Thank
Thanks for
you. Yeah,
having
it's
me,
great to
Chris.
be here.
And I'll admit, Dan, I feel like I'm kind of just pulling in a ringer here, because in your day job you work at Gettysburg, so you're kind of immersed in this. And then Evan, you're just like Gettysburg super scholar fanboy kind of thing. So I thought, I want to talk about Gettysburg a little bit. Let me get a couple guys that really know this stuff. So my interest in talking today is actually sparked by a conversation I had for the podcast with Jared Peatman in his new regimental history about the 20th Maine. And in that conversation, he quotes the great Harry Pfanz, Gettysburg scholar, who said, July 2nd needed a lot of saving. And I thought, that's a really interesting lens to kind of look at the events of July 2nd, which of course are iconic in so many ways. So let me just start by asking you each about that statement. And Dan, I'll start with you. In your opinion, what is the idea that July 2nd needs a lot of saving? What does that mean?
I think we can look at it from, really a top down or bottom up approach from individual units on both sides, needing support, needing reinforcements to higher ranking units, larger units from your regiments up to your brigades to your division needing support, to your staff work and your intelligence needing saved, to your ability to lead and step into a new role, and kind of saving those early steps in a new position. Tactically, strategically, I think both sides, there's a lot of moments that need to be saved. And I think for a lot of commanders at various ranks on the field on July 2nd, they were hoping for those saving type moments that did not come.
Yeah, yeah. Evan, how about you? How do you approach that phrase?
Yeah, I mean, I think for as much attention as the third day at Gettysburg gets with Pickett's charge and kind of all the drama there, I think in some cases the second day is almost more dramatic. You have both sides kind of throwing everything they have into the fight and into the fray. So when I guess when I hear that phrase, I think of some of the fighting on the south end of the field and just commanders kind of plugging in or throwing in what they have to fill the gaps. And then of course on the north end of the field, on Cemetery Hills and Culp's Hill, some of the key terrain at Gettysburg.
Yeah, and I'll encourage our listeners to kind of think broadly and literally, as Dan mentions, units need saved or a spot needs saved, but also sort of thematically or metaphorically, like Meade's staff work needs some attention. Robert E. Lee's plan needs some attention. So those might be ways things get saved. Let's start with Little Round Top, since that's where Jared and I kind of came up with this idea and sort of what sparked my impetus for this conversation. And Evan, I'll have you answer this first. Just if we have to think of Little Round Top as needing to be saved, is that even a true statement, or are things okay down there?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That sounds like a big can of worms to open. I mean, I would say, the men that fought there thought that it needed saved, which, I mean, I think if anyone's read kind of a regimental history, you come away, um, kind of thinking that that particular regiment saved the Union and saved, the Republic. And of course, the 20th Maine is not an exception to that, or even, Vincent's brigade. But yeah, I mean, we could get into kind of the nitty gritty of was Little Round Top the key terrain? I think it definitely was on the south end of the field. But is Meade's position untenable if he loses Little Round Top? Probably not necessarily. But I think in the moment, if you put yourself in the position of anyone, I guess, wearing blue at that time, and you have, Longstreet's corps coming off of Warfield Ridge there, and Devil's Den is kind of, enveloped in smoke, right? And you see that nobody is on Little Round Top. I think, you probably would have acted, or hopefully maybe would have acted, like people, like Warren or Vincent, um, So yeah, I mean, I think it according to the men that fought there, it certainly needed saved, and they did the saving.
Dan?
Boy, it's just a big can of worms to tackle so early in the conversation. I do agree with Evan in that for many that day at Little Round Top in the Union Army, they definitely would agree that it needed saving. Um, from the moment that Governor K. Warren gets up there and sees the lack of Union presence, um, that this position needs saved for the Union Army. One of the things that I think we often forget about, and despite the tenacity of the fighting on Little Round Top by regiments like the 20th Maine, but please let's not forget the other units that are up there as well, is there has seemed to be this trend. And, even around the time that Harry Pfanz's Second Day book came out, in which he has this phrase about things needing saving and talks about Little Round Top, is that somehow the loss of Little Round Top, if they are unable to save Little Round Top, would impact the Union Army in such a way that perhaps the Union position would be compromised, the Union position would be turned, the Union Army would have lost on July 2nd. And I think one of the things that a lot of modern studies ignore is that Little Round Top is not the objective for the Confederate attack on July 2nd, is not the objective for Longstreet's Corps on July 2nd. So when you look at it in that lens, on the flip side of the coin from the Confederate perspective, is Little Round Top something that the Confederates need to save from Union hands? And the proof is in the pudding when we talk about the effectiveness of Little Round Top as a position. And particularly an artillery platform, and this comes into this notion that, well, if Warren and Chamberlain were unable to save Little Round Top, the Confederates would have got up there. They would have put their artillery up there, and they would have fired northwards along the length of the Union line, and it would have completely forced the Union Army out of their battle line. Little Round Top is a terrible artillery platform. Even Governor Warren tells this to Hazlitt as he's bringing his battery up there. Like, it's ineffective. What are you going to do up here? What are you going to shoot at? And there's that famous exchange, that Hazlitt says roughly that it's going to, lift the morale of the men, that are fighting up here on this hill. That ties into this kind of diatribe that I'm going into, is that Little Round Top from west to east does not have a very large platform in which to place artillery.
Mm-hmm.
And the requirements of 14 yards between guns would limit the Confederate ability to fire northwards along the Union line if they had captured Little Round Top, if the Union had failed to save it. And this is more underscored if we look at Hazlitt's battery, commanded by Benjamin Rittenhouse after his wounding on July 3rd. How many rounds was Rittenhouse's battery able to fire into the right flank of Pickett's men during the charge? How much were they able to turn towards the north and the west? And the answer is not much. Rittenhouse writes, I believe in his report, that they're only able to get off 5 or 6 rounds before Pickett's men have moved beyond how they're able to turn the gun. So for the men in the Union Army, a long-winded answer. For the men in the Union Army, for Warren, for Vincent, for Chamberlain, certainly they believed Little Round Top needed to be saved and fought very tenaciously and gallantly to save it for the Union position. But did it really need saving if it's not the Confederate objective?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think people's assumptions about the artillery up there and its effectiveness. And I'm just thinking, from an infantry point of view, if you're assaulting that to recapture the hill, I mean, guns on the top of the hill can't depress to get at infantry if they're coming right at you. So, I mean, you can get in under the guns to assault that hill if you need to. So, from an artillery perspective, it does have some real severe limitations.
It sounds like you're giving some credit here to Sickles, arguing it's a bad area.
Let's not go that far. Sickles Lake needs saving. That's kind of
That's another excellent point.
um, but why do you think, Evan? Why do you think that this is assumed in such a large position in people's imaginations about the story of Gettysburg? Then, if like,
Yeah.
tactically, maybe it's not.
Well, I mean, I think you just mentioned Sickles. I think a lot of it kind of has to do with Sickles. And if you're reading some of the post-war accounts and, all these guys that are kind of reliving their experience at Gettysburg, like Chamberlain and Warren, um, Meade, right? The Meade Sickles kind of debacle, right? Sickles goes out to the peach orchard and leaves Little Round Top completely, abandoned essentially. And so even Meade at one point, if I'm not mistaken, kind of refers at least maybe obliquely to Little Round Top as kind of the key terrain at Gettysburg, which I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that. But if, and of course Chamberlain and Warren kind of have other motives, right? That they're talking about their actions and stuff on Little Round Top, and I think some of the overemphasis on Little Round Top comes out of that. Um, as far as visitation, I mean, you can't beat the view, right? Like
Yeah.
it's one of the most beautiful spots on the battlefield. So I think that's also a factor for some of its popularity. But I mean, I'm an 11th Corps guy. I will always kind of believe that Cemetery Hill is the linchpin of the Union line, and the key terrain there on the battlefield. And I know I don't want to get ahead of myself if we talk
Okay,
about
and we'll
Gettysburg.
definitely get up there.
Sure.
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah,
Well, and I think the other aspect to look at this is something we talk a lot about at Emerging Civil War, and we have a book in the 10th anniversary series about it. When we look at memory and we look at Civil War and popular culture, certainly with the publication of the Killer Angels, the movie Gettysburg, Ken Burns' Civil War, it places such a heavy emphasis. And let's not forget all these Civil War artists of the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. There's such a heavy emphasis placed on the importance of Little Round Top. And it's a dramatic story, absolutely dramatic story. And you couple that story with, getting up there in person, why it's so important to visit these places. It really lends itself to, uh, you know, that quintessential Civil War moment, a defining Civil War moment. And so I think we see a lot of that emphasis placed on that because of, this shift in that we see in popular culture and memory about Little Round Top. One of the things to really kind of think about is that, when the movie Gettysburg comes out, Ken Burns comes out, all the, in the late 80s and the early 90s, the Park Service didn't really have a lot of wayside
Yeah.
exhibits at the 20th Maine and mentioning Chamberlain or mentioning Vincent. So, it is such a huge impact on and I hate to say just American consciousness because we have so many international visitors that come to the battlefield. That this story and this place, particularly Little Round Top, particularly Joshua Chamberlain, really kind of changes the direction in this theme we're talking about here today, which is what needed saving. And for perhaps the last 30 or 40 years, for the American consciousness, the international consciousness, the Civil War consciousness, if you will, Little Round Top is it.
Yeah. And let me ask too, and I also kind of imagine, since you mentioned Chamberlain, and his impact in pop culture, like what if someone else on that hilltop had also been a really good writer and spent the whole rest of their lives writing about, how the 140th New York came in and saved the day, or, like Governor K. Warren saved, like there are a lot of save the day stories up there, but Chamberlain just happens to have talent with a pen and a platform with which to promote the writing that he does. Um, that's
Oh,
huge.
absolutely. I mean, as good as, say, the regimental history of the 83rd Pennsylvania is, which was Strong Vincent's regiment before he took over command of the brigade, Judson Clark just doesn't have the quill that Joshua Chamberlain does.
Yeah.
You're 100% right, and I think Evan would agree with that as an 11th Corps guy. Who in the 11th Corps is eloquently writing about the defense of the northern approaches to town, or what they do on July 2nd at Cemetery Hill. And I think, the level of the writing, the quality of the writing, helps shape, for better or worse, our understanding of some of these moments.
Uh, uh,
Um, when we think of the cannonade on July 3rd, folks are going to read Alexander. Alexander's a great writer when he talks about the cannonade. You're not necessarily, reading something written by, Captain Rory up on Cemetery Ridge as this great moments taking place in military history. So
yeah.
you raise a great point. And, here at ECW, we're all jealous of your quill, Mr. Mackowski, as we all, toil in our writing. We love the research, but I know for me personally, writing is much more of a chore than it is digging the stories out.
It's in me and it got to get out. Uh, Before we move away from the south end of the field, Evan, let me ask you, a lot of emphasis gets put on the Chamberlain story, but what impact does Warren's story have on the Hill? And not just like in the moment on July 2nd, but his court martial and his statue and his commemoration, like that also, I think, has an impact. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely does. And I will say, I mean, for as much as I am an 11th Corps guy too, I mean, Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were so formative to my interest in the Civil War that,
Sure.
I'll always be fascinated with their story and even, kind of the mythology that comes out of it. And, where that line blurs maybe. But yeah, I mean, I think, Warren kind of has an ulterior motive or just even a motive, right? For promoting his own actions on July 2nd and saving the Hill. Of course, he kind of leaves in disgrace, at the Battle of Five Forks, and after
Not by choice.
not by choice, right? Yeah, yeah, and after his some of his issues with Philip Sheridan, and so for the rest of his life, he's kind of trying to uh, repair his reputation, right? And even Chamberlain, I think, testifies on his behalf at his court martial because they're both Fifth Corps guys. So yeah, I mean, I think that if maybe not to the extent that Chamberlain has kind of shaped our memory, also plays a factor because whose statue do you see,
Yeah.
right? When you walk up to Little Round Top, whose statue is maybe the subject of more photographs on the battlefield than any other? It's Governor Warren.
Yeah.
So for sure.
Literally larger than life statue. Yeah.
True.
Yeah. Dan, thoughts about old Goovy? Goovy.
I think since we're continuing to hammer away or chip away at this idea of saving on July 2nd, I think Evan raises a good point, is that Warren in the post-war years attempts to save his reputation. And he is going to utilize his actions at Gettysburg and particularly on Little Round Top to help save and repair that reputation that is damaged in 1865. I think what's interesting about that is how quickly that fades. Warren's role fades after his death.
Hmm.
And, it helps to outlive everyone else when you are a figure in a historical event. Your story is the one that endures. It's like the last note an orchestra plays. That's the one you remember at the end of the concert, not the first one, not the one in the middle, but it's the last one. And Chamberlain lives a very, very long time, and so despite Chamberlain's efforts and other efforts and Warren's efforts to kind of repair his reputation via the saving of Little Round Top, um, you know, it quickly fades after his death.
Yeah. It's one of those things, when I'm showing guests around Spotsylvania and, talking about Warren opening the action. And the Warren statue at Little Round Top is the one point of reference people have. If they know anything about Warren, it's like, oh, you probably remember his statue from Little Round Top. Oh, yeah, that's the guy. And that's the one thing that people know for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we leave, then, Dan, and I'm sure you get this question a lot because people are there looking for Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and Buster Kilrain. Are there other stories on Little Round Top that you recommend people dive into to go beyond the 20th Maine story? Because I mean, there are a lot of compelling stories out there.
Oh my goodness. I think the role of the U.S. Signal Corps on Little Round Top is completely overshadowed. Hardly a footnote in many, many stories and retellings of Little Round Top. They do have a monument up there. Unfortunately, it's just a plaque and is literally in the shadow of this very well-known bronze monument to Warren. I think that's a great story. Any of the units that deploy on the northern side of Little Round Top are almost
Yeah.
always forgotten. If we look at Gibbs, Ohio Battery, and really the whole northern end of Little Round Top, this is the final moments of Longstreet's attack on the south end of the field with the arrival of Wofford's Georgians, and they're sweeping up some of the remnants of the Confederates in and around the wheat field, and they're driving on the northern end of Little Round Top. The arrival of the Pennsylvania Reserves sweeping over the northern end of Little Round Top and running headlong into this attack. And some of the men in those Pennsylvania Reserve units were from Gettysburg. They were from Adams County. They are fighting on ground that they grew up on. What a compelling story that is oftentimes overlooked up there. So, I think that Chamberlain did a great job on July 2nd of 1863, aiding in a group effort, an
Yeah.
overall effort of saving Little Round Top. And I think personally, he did a great job of saving his legacy and his story of what he did up there. But there's so many other um, compelling moments in the defense of Little Round Top that I think need to be saved for future generations.
Evan, any other stories you point people to, or to go beyond Chamberlain?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, any other regiment of Vincent's brigade, I would say. I mean, 83rd, Dan, you mentioned the 83rd Pennsylvania, which is commanded by a captain, right? Captain Woodward. It's not even a colonel, lieutenant colonel, or major at that point. Um, of course, the 16th Michigan, 44th New York, and then even just the story of Vincent, right? He's from Erie, Pennsylvania, a lawyer. I mean, he's perhaps maybe a little bit more well known than some of these other guys, but I think his story is as equally compelling as Chamberlain's even.
Uh,
And then of course the 140th New York, Patty O'Rourke who's killed there. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of stuff to be had going on
uh,
in just a span of a few minutes, right? On Little
yeah.
Round Top.
I've taken a greater interest in the 83rd Pennsylvania and the 140th New York because my section of Western New York is equidistant between where those two regiments came from. And so I sort of feel like I've got a little bit of a connection to both. So let's switch to the north end of the field because, of course, a lot of people say, well, yeah, things down in Little Round Top were pretty intense, but they were just as intense in Culp's Hill and Pep Green saves the day up there, but nobody wrote a book about him. Dan, you've spent a lot of time talking about Pat Green in your career. It's something of particular interest. Tell us what's going on the north end of the fish hook and why does that need saved?
So we need to take a step back and look at Robert E. Lee's overall plan for July 2nd with the Confederate Army. They're flush from victory on July 1st. Lee's hoping, one more significant victory south of Gettysburg is going to claim the battle and a total victory for the Confederate Army. And one of the things that Lee is going to do, and he does it time and again, and this really emphasizes for the super hardcore Gettysburg folk out there to get outside of Gettysburg in your Civil War studies,
Uh,
is Lee is going to utilize a strategy that he has used on other battlefields in the past year of the Civil War. And that is a massive effort against one end of the Union line and a diversionary assault on the other end of the line. And I think a great example,
mm.
or great, right? That great, we've got great examples of this. And, one of the things you can look at is, look at Second Manassas at the end of August, how that plans out. But suffice it to say, the main effort by Lee's army is going to come in the way of Longstreet's corps against the Union left. And we can debate where Lee believes the Union left is versus where it really is. That's a whole other story. But the diversionary assault on July 2nd is going to be against Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, the barb of the famous fish hook, which they're not calling it the fish hook in 1863. General Meade's like, let's get in the fish hook. We're gonna get the fish hooked out alive. We're gonna get the position.
We'll
So
catch us a big fish for this one.
yeah, we're gonna catch some big fish, catch a lead trout. Um, so the diversionary effort is going to be led by uh, the Confederate Second Corps, Richard Stoddard Ewell's Corps, against Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. Um, what becomes perilous for the Union Army in these positions, and 100,000 foot view as to why they need saving, is who exactly are at these positions. So, a good chunk of Cemetery Hill, certainly the eastern side of Cemetery Hill and into the northern side of Cemetery Hill, as Evan mentioned earlier, are units from the 11th Corps. And despite a heroic stand, and I think that's an adjective not used a lot when we talk about the 11th Corps in Gettysburg, but despite a heroic stand north of town in which these units were severely mauled via casualty numbers, by the time they get to Cemetery Hill, it's an important position that is largely defended by very thin units, both in numbers and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Culp's Hill, at the same point in time, although a strong bastion for most of the day of July 2nd, with the presence of the Union Army's 12th Corps and some of those bruised, battered, and beaten units of the 1st Corps, that situation changes. And that brings us to Pap Green. As Little Round Top and the left end of the Union line is under attack, the 12th Corps is going to receive the call to march to the left and shore up the left of the Union line. And that's going to leave about 1,300 men, 5 New York regiments under the command of George Sears Green, or Old Pap Green. So, we have one part of this fishhook, Culp's Hill, that is now severely undermanned. And then we have Cemetery Hill, where a good portion of it is severely undermanned, not because of the removal of troops, but the nature of what was left of the units that have been ordered to defend the position.
So now here, Levin, is your chance to come in with the 11th Corps. And I don't think I've ever heard that phrase come out of someone's mouth before. I'm an 11th Corps guy.
Yeah,
and we've heard it several times in this conversation.
that's like saying
Yeah.
you're a John Pope fan.
I know, yeah.
I don't
Poor,
know if I'd go that far, but I
poor
mean,
Dan.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think their story is just really compelling. It's an underdog story. Uh they have a bad performance at Chancellorsville, not because of the way they fight, but for other factors that maybe we won't get into today. And of course they're pushed off the field on July 1st too, and pretty mauled, right? As Dan said. I mean, they take some pretty significant casualties up on the Gettysburg Plain on the first day. And so when they take position on Cemetery Hill, I mean, I think this is kind of their uh, redemption story, right? They defend it. It's a fierce hand to hand battle at some points, and also kind of a dramatic setting, right? The sun is setting over the hills of Gettysburg. It's almost dark out, kind of dusk at this point, and they're overwhelmed by two Confederate brigades, the Louisiana Tigers by under the command of Harry Hayes, and then a North Carolina brigade under the command of Isaac Avery. And so I believe Leopold von Gils's brigade is the first to kind of fall back. He's positioned right along Wainwright Avenue, I believe, just kind of on the slope, like in between Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. If you're kind of imagining yourself on East Cemetery Hill, and then Ames's brigade also kind of falls back, and then that leaves the guns under Michael Viedrich's battery, which are located just around Oliver Otis Howard's equestrian statue, vulnerable, and the gunners are defending their pieces with pretty much anything they have, hammers, rammers, hand spikes, and at that point, Carroll's brigade from the Second Corps comes charging in, and I mean, they are tenacious unto themselves, but I think sometimes they're kind of elevated, right? That these Second Corps guys under Hancock had to come in and save the damn Dutch, as Wainwright would probably probably call them. And he himself, talks about having to like smack some of the German gunners back into line with his sword, which I don't necessarily buy. I think Michael Friedrich's German gunners from Buffalo, New York, Chris, um, you know, could handle themselves very well and did so on the night of July 2nd. But you also have, Carl Schurz, who's a division commander at this point, funneling people in from his division and just really trying to save Cemetery Hill, which I think is the key terrain, right? It's the linchpin of the federal position of that fishhook. So it really, is this dramatic moment there at the very end of July 2nd and the fighting that takes place on that day.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is, and something for folks to consider and ponder, as Evan just mentioned, that's the key point, the linchpin. One of the things I've always pondered is, if this is such an important position for the Union Army, if this is the key ground, the key terrain, why is it so poorly attended to? Where is the understanding that these 11th Corps units and First Corps units are beat up? We have some of the accounts of from the Ohioans in Ames that'll become Harris's brigade by July 2nd. The one account talks about the guys having all the elbow room they needed at the base of this hill. These guys were talking about having 5 yards between a man and the regimental lines because it's so thin. So that often begs the question: should Cemetery Hill have ever been in a position to need to be saved on the evening of July 2nd? Certainly, there are enough units in the area. That these positions can be supported and shored up. So where's the failure on that? Is that failure with Meade? Is it the failure of those in command of those units to pass that information up the chain of command to understand that these units are, what we call in modern military terms, combat ineffective, that they're going to need more support to be able to hold this ground? Something to definitely ponder and consider.
How much of that too is like Lee's plan is succeeding, because of his an echelon movement up the line, which is forcing Federals to kind of shift in reaction to that. And they're drawing troops from the north end of the field. So on one level, it's like, things are unfolding the way Lee's hoping that they would unfold.
And to no credit to Lee,
Yeah.
because Lee's plan is that the diversionary assault and the main attack is to go forward at the same time. Ewell's men are supposed to move out upon hearing the sound of Longstreet's guns, and we know that is not the case. That does not happen. There's this phenomenon on the Gettysburg battlefield known as acoustic shadows, and so the diversionary assault gets a delay. It goes forward about an hour and a half later than it should have, because but preceding the diversionary assault, there is a cannonade, which I think is far more compelling and interesting of a story than the cannonade on July 3rd, particularly when you start looking at the casualties amongst batteries and damages being done, how well the gunners in these batteries are operating their pieces on July 2nd. But, yeah, you're right. Meade is being forced to funnel troops away from these places, but he's not pulling them from Cemetery Hill. He does pull them from Paulsville. He's not pulling from Cemetery Hill. So that tells you that Cemetery Hill's light in troops to begin with. He doesn't have anybody to pull from there.
Yeah.
But to no credit to Lee, the plan has gone off the rails from the beginning, but it is working. That Meade is having to funnel troops away from this key terrain at Culpsville and Cemetery Hill.
It sounds like Lee's plan needs to be saved. Oh,
no, that's another good one.
So and I want to come back to Culp's Hill in a second, but since we've already slid up to Cemetery Hill, that tends to really get forgotten about. Like, everyone focuses on Little Round Top, and then there'll be those, defenders of Culp's Hill be like, oh, well, it was just as important. But like Cemetery Hill is really a close thing. And it is the bend in the fish hook. What are the stakes at that moment? What happens if the fish hook falls or the bend of the fish hook falls? Evan, let me have you start with that, and then Dan, I'll have you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. It's probably the $1 million question, right? Or one of them. Um, we don't know. I mean, we can speculate maybe that Meade perhaps could fall back to Powers Hill, right, which is where his headquarters kind of ends up after he's uh, you know, forced to vacate the Leicester house on the third day. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think once Cemetery Hill, or if Cemetery Hill would fall, that would kind of be uh, an emergency moment for Meade and for the Union Army. Maybe he would fall back to his Pipe Creek line. I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
the scenarios are endless, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately an unanswerable question, but I think asking it helps us
Yeah.
understand what the stakes are in that moment. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Um, I'll speculate a little more strongly than Evan,
Okay.
almost to a certainty that if Culp's Hill or Cemetery Hill falls, Meade's done at Gettysburg, bar
Okay.
none. Um, what Cemetery Hill and particularly Culp's Hill offers the Union Army is one one, but a secondary as well, but not as huge lifeline to the Union Army. The Baltimore Pike is the key to the Union Army's position south of the town of Gettysburg. It is the lifeblood to the Union Army. It is bringing men. It is bringing material. It is evacuating wounded. It is maneuvering communications. It is providing access for me to shift troops like he does from Culp's Hill to utilize interior lines. So the Baltimore Pike being the primary, the second in the area is the Taneytown Road, which comes up, over the western side of Cemetery Hill. Another
Very important access to pizza though, to Tommy's Pizza.
yes,
So
yes, yes. And if you like cold beverages, just across the street, a fine establishment as well. But if in my mind, and we get into these what if scenarios, right? These speculative questions. And Chris being a Jackson guy, I'm sure you've heard more than most about Jackson at Gettysburg. But for me, the real close call, the real what if moment, the real, you know, could the Confederate Army have won scenario is bar none. Culp's Hill, July 2nd, and Cemetery Hill, July 2nd. Confederate troops get within 40, 50 yards of the Baltimore Pike on two occasions that night, and they hold it. Cemetery Hill, 15 to 20 minutes before they're kicked out. But one brigade of the Confederate Army, excuse me, George Stewart's brigade gets a foothold on Culp's Hill near the Baltimore Pike. That right there is the key to Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. They get the Baltimore Pike, Meade is done at Gettysburg. Now, I think one of the broader questions I want to get back to about saving Cemetery Hill, why it's neglected in studies today, is I think really when it comes to saving the ground as a battlefield and preservation. Cemetery Hill kind of goes from this arc of civilian use, the town's private cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, farm fields, to battlefield, to the National Cemetery. And, the National Cemetery's placement there really transitions it from battlefield to place of remembrance
okay.
and the Gettysburg Address. And so it kind of loses that harsh reality of war, of what it really was. Now, where the majority of the fighting happens on Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill, a good chunk of it is preserved. But Cemetery Hill as a whole is largely grown up upon. Development and infrastructure grows up onto the hill. The hill itself in certain areas is graded, so the height is lower than it would have been. One of the reasons why Ewell believes that attacking that position on July 1st is impracticable is because there's over a mile of open ground in every direction leading up the Cemetery Hill. And with the loss of that ground preservationally, with the inability to save it, we have lost our understanding and appreciation for it as a military asset to the Union Army.
Yeah. Well, Evan, let me circle that back to 11th Corps guys for a second, then, if that's the place that they kind of stake their fallback position after getting beaten up on July 1st, they're really instrumental in its defense. And yet that battlefield gets lost and developed and gets a big water tower and all that sort of stuff. What does that do for the reputation of the 11th Corps historically?
It certainly doesn't help, right? Yeah, I mean, I think, the fact that, well, I mean, what is, to Dan's point, what is Cemetery Hill kind of known for today? It's the National Cemetery and the Gettysburg Address, right? So, and that's certainly not the 11th Corps, unless you're, I don't know, geeks or nerds like me that geek out over the Germans and the guys of the 11th Corps. But, yeah, I mean, I think that also kind of plays a hand in diverting attention over to Little Round Top and maybe some of the stories um, over there, or other parts of the field like Pickett's Charge and stuff like that. But the fact that we can't interpret Cemetery Hill, like Dan said, in the way that soldiers saw it at that time, and just kind of the changes to the terrain and even the meaning of the hill, I think plays a pretty big role in maybe not uh, not bringing it the attention or the importance that it perhaps deserves.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it would have been like to stand on High Street and look across where the school is now and have that all open and think like,
Yeah.
I gotta cross that. Dan, you were gonna
Yeah.
add something a second ago.
I was going to say, it's in modern visitation and modern consciousness, it's a much more, you know, wonderful photo opportunity of a sunset
Yeah,
of Little Round Top and General Warren than a sunset behind a water tower
right.
and a school. So, even visitationally speaking, Cemetery Hills, I think beauty and historically beautiful. The setting before the battle, beautiful in the regards of the terrain and whatnot, their surrounding fields. It's gone.
Yeah.
So you just don't have those views.
And of course, with the road still going through that part of the battlefield where Little Round Top is removed from the
Yeah,
main road, I think that just traffic wise has an impact. I want to swing back to Culp's Hill just for a little bit because I feel
sure.
like we kind of jumped over it to get to Cemetery Hill, which I agree was like, a hinge moment there. But I'm fascinated by how ugly that fight at Culp's Hill get, how desperate it gets, and the landscape restoration that's happened there over the past couple of years has really done a lot to make that a much more evocative scene to understand. Dan, you spent a lot of time doing programs up there. I know it's one of your very favorite parts of the battlefield. Um, uh, just tell me a little bit more about like, what's the save the day? What are the stakes there at that moment?
Stakes were really high. Once the 12th Corps is gone, it leaves behind George Greene's brigade, a New York regiment's about 1,400 men. He's really up against 3-1 odds, and for me, that's a far more compelling story than what Chamberlain's up against. We get a lot of Chamberlain gets a lot of spotlight, but when you boil it down to the numbers, Chamberlain, the 20th Maine versus the 15th Alabama, it's about a 1-1 contest. For George Sears Greene, he's up against three Confederate brigades of Edward Allegheny Johnson's division. And as I mentioned, 3-1 odds. Not only is the numbers a problem for him, but as you mentioned, the restoration has really opened up a lot of the Confederate attack. Culp's Hill is often misunderstood in the fact that it is two hills. There's an upper hill and a lower hill, and the terrain changes greatly from one end of the 12th Corps position to the other end of the 12th Corps position. So, George Sears Greene's men have to deal with the challenges of the changing terrain. Some of the terrain in their front will make any Confederate attack against it much more difficult, whereas other terrain is much more gentle and much more allowing of a weighted Confederate attack to reach their lines. Couple that with the removal of the 12th Corps, now Greene has to, basically extend his line to cover a position that a corps was covering before. He just does not have enough men to do it. Now, one of the saving graces up there and changes to terrain, and this is kind of debated, is the order of entrenchments or breastworks, which really helps save the Union position up there. There's the apocryphal story from a soldier in the 149th New York, a commander of the 149th New York, part of Greene's brigade, that witnesses a conversation between Greene, his brigade commander or division commander John Geary, and some of the other commanders in that division. And the conversation goes according to this historian, that the regimental historian of the 149th New York and veteran, that John Geary's against building of breastworks. You rather have the men, stand up and fight. And Greene is the only one in the division says, if my men have time to build them, they will have them. And Greene goes off and starts having his men construct these entrenchments. Either way, there's already some entrenchments up there. The remnants of the First Corps had started digging in on the evening of the 1st, but far and away, the breastworks and entrenchments that Greene builds is perhaps some of the finest up there. Greene is an incredibly intelligent man, varied life experiences, military experience, engineering experience. These are really stalwart positions that he develops. And he's overseen their construction over a period of 6 hours. There's a guy 62 years old, 89 degrees on July 2nd, hiking up and down that hill multiple times, overseeing the construction of these works. And they are a huge lifeline to the defense of Culp's Hill. And they really not only save Greene's brigade, when you look at the casualties that Greene inflicts versus what he receives on July 2nd, they not only save his brigade from annihilation up there, being completely overwhelmed, but they save the 12th Corps position and the right flank of the Union Army.
Anything you want to add, Evan, to Dan's story there?
No, I mean, I just that, yeah, I mean, Culp's Hill, even though maybe it doesn't command my fascination as much as the 11th Corps does or the Cemetery Hill, has always been interesting to me. And just, even especially like the Union's efforts to resave Culp's Hill the next day, right? Because the Confederates gained that foothold on Lower Culp's Hill. So definitely important stuff.
Yeah, Dan, let me have you pitch in on David Ireland for a second, since
Yeah.
he's an instrumental figure in part of the saving the day and never gets to tell his own story because of his early demise.
Yeah. So, for all the Gettysburg aficionados out there, and we're going to get Evan worked away from Cemetery Hill. We're going to bring him over to Culp's Hill. We'll bring him in the fold. We're gonna get everybody away from the southern end of the field on July 2nd and really, have you embrace where the Battle of Gettysburg was won for the Union Army, and that is Culp's Hill on the evening of July 2nd. And a huge figure in that is Colonel David Ireland. He is the commanding officer of the 137th New York. And the 137th New York, in Greene's brigade on July 2nd, when they go into position, is on the right end of the line. And for most of the day on July 2nd until the evening of July 2nd, General Greene and David Ireland have more Union units of the 12th Corps off to their right. They have other Union brigades off to their right. But when the 12th Corps leaves, as David Ireland and the 137th on the right flank of the Union Army, they are now alone. And one of the things that Greene has to do, as I mentioned earlier, to cover all of this physical space, these earthworks that have been left unattended due to the loss of the rest of the 12th Corps as they're packing up and heading south, is they have to shift the line and they have to extend the line. And one of the things they'll do in that effort is, in many cases, the units will undouble their lines to extend it and fill that. So that places David Ireland even more so out in the open and farther away from the summit of Culp's Hill, where the tower is today and the monument to Greene is today. So David Ireland finds himself in the exact same position that Joshua Chamberlain does on the left end of the line. And I think one of the fascinating bookend stories for this is that David Ireland will also order a portion of his unit to refuse their line. This is not like, sole proprietorship of Joshua Chamberlain. He is not the only commanding officer to order his unit to refuse their line. And Ireland As the Confederates are making their attack, he begins to receive fire on his right flank. For those at home that are kind of following the story, Ireland's regiment is basically forms a right angle to the rest of the main line of Greene's brigade, and so Ireland's men have been pouring flanking fire into the rear of a large portion of George Stewart's brigade, men from the Third North Carolina and the First Maryland, as they've been attacking across their front. Well, now upon the arrival of the rest of Stewart's brigade, the 10th Virginia, the 23rd Virginia, they have now got on the 137th's right flank and rear. And so Ireland orders them to refuse their line. It is a brief stand with the refused position before Ireland's going to have to order them to pull out. And they will fall back into what is known as the Traverse. Now, we don't know who builds the Traverse. It is a kind of rough entrenchment. It is a position that is built along any sort of entrenchments. And it's basically if your line gets turned, if your attack's coming from a different direction in which your entrenchments are facing, you can maneuver into it. We don't know who orders its construction, but it becomes a godsend for the 137th and David Ireland. And they will fall back in there. There will be a brief bayonet charge made by some members of the 137th New York. They'll hop out of the Traverse and charge into the face of some of those Virginians to slow down their attack. And luckily, the 137th is saved and Greene is saved, as some of those First Corps units, the 84th New York, also known as the 14th Brooklyn, and the 6th Wisconsin, the famed Iron Brigade, will show up and help shore up the 137th's position. It is, in my historical opinion, a far more dramatic moment than Little Round Top. The odds are far more substantial, particularly in favor of the Confederate attack, particularly in favor of the number of men available to shore up Greene's line or to shore up the right flank. And Ireland does it in such a cool, calm, and collected manner. And he is pointed out by several commanding officers in official reports of the battle. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, Chris, his untimely demise really robs him of a lot of that limelight for his actions and his unit's actions at Culp's Hill on July 2nd. And as we talked about earlier, when it comes to Little Round Top, Chamberlain outlives everybody. So his story is the last to be heard. Ireland doesn't make it through the war. And so his moment there on Culp's Hill is largely forgotten. And not just his, but Greene's moment is largely forgotten. And the 12th Corps role in Gettysburg is largely forgotten. And that happens right out of the gate. Yeah. The 12th Corps, to kind of wrap this story up quickly, the reports of the 12th Corps do not get to Meade before Meade files his official reports of the campaign and battle. And they are left out of that initial report. And it's something that Meade will not fully correct in the historical record in 1864 and going forward. So this dramatic moment, the real crisis of the Union Army, the savior of the Union Army's position, is kind of lost to history right out of the gate.
Yeah, and poor Ireland, he dies in September of '64 of dysentery. So, I mean, what an ignoble way to, a very common but ignoble way to go too. So, how unfortunate. So, I think there's one more saving we have to do before, and we're running close to our time here. But Evan, Dan Sickles, does he save or is he saved? Which is
Oh
a
man.
whole podcast in and of itself.
Yeah, another can of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think he needs to be saved. Yeah, I mean, to Dan's point, Chamberlain's not the only regimental commander that refuses his line. He's also not the only regimental commander from Maine that refuses his line. The 17th Maine, which is under Sickles' command, has to do that in the wheat field, right? Because they just don't have enough men to occupy the line of the Third Corps from the Emmitsburg Road all the way to Devil's Den. So that I think that necessitates um, Meade and Warren and some of these other commanders to throw in men from other parts of the line, and to Dan's point, those interior lines really help in that situation. But I don't know, when I think of July 2nd, and think of saving, um, in addition to people like David Ireland and Joshua Chamberlain, I think of Jacob Schweitzer's brigade, because they have to save the wheat field essentially, or they have to save the Union troops in the wheat field. And for anyone that doesn't know, they're initially stationed in the wheat field as part of that initial effort to bolster Sickles' line, and then they're thrown in to basically be this sacrificial lamb for Caldwell's division as they're pulling back from the wheat field. And at one point, Jacob Schweitzer and his three regiments also refuse their line, and so they're getting hit from different angles, right? And Schweitzer's color bearer kind of famously looks back and sees Confederates coming from their right and their rear, and he says, "I'll be damned if we're not faced the wrong way, Colonel." So they're out there in the open, and they have to kind of put up this stand that not many people really talk about before they're forced back. So I definitely think that Sickles needs saving, whether he would want you to think that or not.
Dan, what do you think? Saved or be saved?
Complete agreement with Evan. And, since Evan kind of covered it well with examples of different Union units that need to save Sickles, I'll tackle it from the opposite side of the coin. What do the Confederates say about Sickles' movement? There's only a handful of Confederate officers that go beyond the lost cause mythology when it comes to Gettysburg and their reflections on Gettysburg, and really look at it through a very fair lens. And I think one of those Confederates is Lafayette McLaws. Lafayette McLaws avoids all the lost cause stuff. He's very, very balanced in his critiques of the Gettysburg campaign and the Battle of Gettysburg thereof. And McLaws is reading about a speech that General Sickles gave, and I believe it's at Faneuil Hall in Boston in 1885 or 1886. And McLaws writes a response to it because he's still kind of blown away that Sickles is, billing himself as the savior of the Union at Gettysburg, the savior of Meade's line, the savior of the entirety of the war for the Union Army there at Gettysburg. And McLaws basically writes that, General Meade had made the Union Army's position impregnable. That the right end of Meade's line was so, such a strong position that there's no way the Confederates were going to have any success there. And McLaws goes on to say that, the left was the same way. If Sickles would have stayed in position, it would have been the same way. And McLaws goes on to say that, if Sickles would have stayed there, if he would have never left that stretch of ground from the southern end of Cemetery Ridge to Little Round Top, he said that, McLaws said that the attacking party, McLaws's division, Hood's division, would have been defeated with far greater loss to themselves, with much less loss to the defenders than what actually happened. And so, I think that's a great testament to the fact of how desperately the Union Army had to fight to save Sickles and the left end of their line.
Mm-hmm. Well, and tell me though, McLaws has kind of got an axe to grind about Longstreet at that period in his career and in his writings. Does that influence his perception of how he's interpreting events at the end of that field?
I don't think so. We don't have a lot of McLaws. He's not a very vocal post-war writer. And you're right, he does have an axe to grind against Longstreet for what happens out west. But he is when it comes to Gettysburg, I think he's one of the more fair critics
Okay.
of the Confederate High Command and the mistakes that were made. And in this particular instance, I think he's going more after this belief that Sickles was the savior of the Union, more so than Longstreet's attack failing. So in that regard, he's coming more to Sickles' criticism than Longstreet's defense, or Sickles' own idea of what he did or did not do. But there's a handful. I think E.P. Alexander is another great example, good writer about the Battle of Gettysburg. But um, we've been talking about things that need saved, and I think some of the Gettysburg story still needs saved. I think we talked a lot about aspects of the story that's been ignored, aspects of the battle that just haven't been studied. And I think some of the mythology still needs to be saved from itself
Yeah.
as we work in the field of public history to really put those accounts, those perspectives, those stories in their rightful place in the larger events of July of 1863.
Yeah, I definitely agree that idea. Like the history needs saved from the mythology at Gettysburg, more so maybe than on any other American landscape. And
Yeah.
you're wearing a Lexington and Concord hat, by the way, which is also a very mythologized landscape. But Gettysburg is definitely a victim of its own mythology. I really like that idea. Evan, what are some other things as we get ready to wrap up? What are other things that people should think about when we're thinking about July 2nd needs a lot of saving? What are some things that you'd maybe suggest people consider?
I mean, we've kind of touched on this, but the Confederates need saving. And I think one of the things, if you read Confederate accounts throughout that day, um, one of the recurring themes is that once Confederates gain a foothold, for example, I think one of Harry Hayes's Louisiana Tigers writes, once he gets to Cemetery Hill, he's looking back for reinforcements and nobody's there, right, to help him. And that's something that you see throughout, the Confederate writings on July 2nd. Ambrose Wright gains a foothold on Cemetery Ridge, right? And he, whether you believe him or not, he can see Meade's headquarters down over the ridge, but nobody's there to exploit that gap. So, is that a fault in Lee's overall plan? Is it just miscommunication between Confederate leaders? I guess
Uh,
we'll kind of never know. But I think that's also kind of a theme that the Confederates need saving throughout the battlefield on that evening.
yeah, yeah. Dan, other things that you'd invite people to think about?
Boy, what a fascinating conversation it's been. And this idea of saving on July 2nd, 1863. Certainly, I think, the Confederate side of the story, we didn't get an opportunity to really touch on and in depth, but from the very beginning, when it comes to July 2nd, Confederate intelligence gathering on July 2nd needed some help.
Yeah,
We're talking about Samuel Johnston and his reconnaissance of the Union left. I think Lee's plan is a solid plan. I don't think there's much that needs saving there. Lee's used this plan on other battlefields, and it's been a victory for him each time. I think when folks come to Gettysburg today, and we often get asked, well, what went wrong? Lee's this victorious commander here at Gettysburg, or excuse me, before Gettysburg and after Gettysburg. He wins some here and there in post 1863, but Lee is this great commander. He's got this solid army with a solid fighting reputation. What goes wrong? Why does he lose Gettysburg? And first and foremost, we have to recognize, I think, something that the boys in blue have something to do about it, right? The Union Army has something to do with Lee's defeat. But I think what needs saving for Lee's army, and it's not just at Gettysburg, but it's the entirety of the campaign, is communication and coordination.
uh,
It is an utter breakdown from start to finish across that army throughout the entirety of the campaign. And if you want to boil down their loss, it is those two things. The appalling lack of communication amongst division commanders, corps commanders, brigade commanders, high command staff, field commands, is just uncharacteristic to Lee's army
uh,
before Gettysburg. And so I really think that the Confederate Army itself needs some saving during the Gettysburg campaign. And maybe that would have gone a long way to assuring a different outcome for Lee and the Army of North Virginia.
yeah, I'll say it in a provocative way. I think Lee's army needs saved from Lee. Only because, and I'm going to beat that metaphor a little bit by saying that, but this is a different army than the army that went into Chancellorsville in its structure and in its communications and its logistics. And so this is the first time you're taking a new weapon into battle and it's untested. And having not tested it, we're going to see a lot of things shake loose as a result. And so Lee's still thinking he's driving the same vehicle into battle, and he's absolutely not. So, and then of
Well,
course, oh, go ahead.
what if Stonewall Jackson was there,
It
Chris?
will see, and it would have solved it all. It would have solved it all. I think the most important thing that needs saved on July 2nd is Alexander Schimmelfennig from the pigsty. That's
There you go.
well, Evan, Dan, I've really appreciated the chance to chat with you guys. It's been a kind of a neat way to look at some things that we think are familiar to us, and really, I hope it's opened some eyes about some stuff.
Yeah, it's been a great time. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Evan, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great. It was a great conversation. I think we could have gone on for much longer than this.
For sure, for sure. Well, I'm Chris Mackowski on behalf of Evan Portman and Dan Welch. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.